Well, good morning, good afternoon, or good evening, depending on when and where you are. And welcome to another Festival in a Box 3.0 tasting session. And today we're going to be looking at the Auchentoshan Sauvignon Blanc edition. And I'm delighted to say we're joined by Joe Ellis of Edrington UK, who are responsible for the bottling of this particular whiskey and many others besides. And I'm going to be talking to him about this particular whiskey and also what he gets up to at Edrington and what it's all about. Hey Joe, how's it going?
Really good, thanks, Eddie. Yeah, how are you?
Yeah, doing pretty good actually, pretty good. You're my first of the day, so nice and fresh.
Amazing. Well, it helps that the whiskey's pretty fresh as well. So
Yeah, absolutely. Well, Joe, listen, thanks so much for giving us a bit of time to come on today and talk to us about this Auchentoshan. Perhaps before you do, you wouldn't mind just introducing yourself and what it is you do within Edrington.
yeah, so my name's Joe. I've been working for Edrington for just over 5 years now. However, I've been in the whiskey industry for 10 years. In Edrington, I'm one of the whiskey specialist team, and the bulk and the vast majority of my time is spent in bars and hotels and restaurants, training the staff in all things whiskey. I'm also WSET spirits accredited, so I can teach WSET, and that's something that we offer to our customers in the trade. So yeah, the bulk of my time is spent educating people on whiskey, which is just genuinely the dream job. Occasionally, I'll also host consumer events and I'll be working at festivals. So hopefully I've seen some of you before and some of you may recognize me from Whiskey Lounge festivals of old. So.
Yeah, absolutely. And long may that continue. Pretty much everyone I've spoken to, without exception, has expressed the love for the job because you'll love whiskey basically, and you like talking about whiskey to other people, which is a very important job and very pleasurable, as you say. Now you're going to be introducing this whiskey for us, this Auchentoshan, which I'm quite excited to taste. I've not tasted before, so I'm going to grab my bottle.
Brilliant.
Now, while I'm pouring and you're pouring, and before perhaps as we get into the nosing and tasting of it, perhaps you can give us a little bit of background about this particular bottling, and then we'll talk more generally about Auchentoshan after that, if that's okay.
Oh yeah, so this is an Amazon exclusive, and Auchentoshan do actually do quite a lot of interesting experiments with their whiskies. The core range, if you like, is quite a kind of industry standard, a mix of bourbon casks and sherry casks of varying sorts. But occasionally we'll do experiments with different types of casks. So something that is actually quite unusual for the single malt industry is using white wine casks. And this is something that we've done here. So we've taken a whiskey which is roughly around 7 years old, that spent the vast majority of its life maturing in ex-bourbon barrels. Again, very standard of the industry to use ex-bourbon barrels. Auchentoshan tends to work a little bit better in ex-bourbon barrels anyway, because the spirit's a light style of floral spirit. So using bourbon barrels really lets the spirit shine through. And then we've taken that approximately 7-year-old single malt and then finished it in French Sauvignon Blanc 225 litre first fill barriques. Those casks are made from a mixture of American oak and French oak, and it's left in those casks for around 14 weeks. Because we're using first fill casks and because the whiskey is still fairly young, it doesn't take long to pick up extra flavour from those white wine casks. Now, actually, if you're into your wines, oaked Sauvignon Blanc is fairly rare as it is. Most Sauvignon Blanc is unoaked. So to get an oaked Sauvignon Blanc and then use those casks in whiskey is something quite unusual. So it's quite exciting to be able to talk about this. It's also a whiskey that is designed to, break break the kind of the usual whiskey drinking rules, if you like. And this is meant to be drunk, chilled from the freezer, ideally. There's been a few different whiskey brands that have done this in the past, but this is meant to be drank from the freezer. We've not done it today because we just haven't. But it's still fine. It's still fine. It's still absolutely fine to drink at room temperature. But it's it's trying to kind of engage people with whiskey in a way that isn't traditional. So that is the whiskey in a nutshell. We bottled it at a slightly higher strength for 47%. So again, we don't just bottle everything at 40 or 43%. We're not scared to kind of bottle at higher strengths for limited releases.
Well, fortunately, or unfortunately, depending on your outlook, my office is quite cold anyway, so it's not quite freezer-like, but certainly it's a bit cooler than the normal room temperature. Do you think that, and perhaps you've already suggested this elsewhere, that because you're kind of suggesting tasting this at a cooler temperature, that it might work in a highball or something like that?
Yeah, and I think that's another thing with whiskies like this. With whiskies that are light and floral and quite elegant, they do work well mixed up in a highball with soda and maybe a little bit of lemon spritz on the top. And I don't think people should be kind of scared about doing that. There seems to be these kind of people say you should never mix single malt in drinks. It's like, yeah, you can. If you spend the money on it, you can do whatever you want with it. So yeah, I think this would work well as like a summer drink, as an alternative to like a gin and tonic, or I know it's not summer at the moment, but if you wanted something refreshing instead of your Bucks Fizz on Christmas Day, maybe try something like this with soda.
Yeah, well, I must admit, I do like a highball, and I think we're seeing more and more of them about, and I have no problem with that whatsoever. It's kind of whiskey's answer to the gin and tonic, isn't it? It's a refreshing long summer drink.
Yeah, I think the beauty of just adding soda and maybe like a little bit of a fruit spritz or a fruit slice is actually, just because it's soda, you're not actually getting rid of any of the flavor. You're literally lengthening the flavor, so it still tastes like the whiskey is supposed to, just longer and bubbly. So
yeah, exactly.
I'm surprised the brand haven't made a fizzy whiskey yet. Put it that way.
Well, I suppose by default they have if they're putting soda water in it, but yeah. I think people might draw the line at a fizzy whiskey. I've got this funny feeling it has been tried actually, but I can't confirm that. Anyway, back to the whiskey itself.
Yeah,
I mean, I genuinely love Auchentoshan anyway, and I think it's one of the whiskies that people occasionally overlook because perhaps it's not the most powerful of single malts, but that's part of its charm. It's triple distilled and all that, and it's just a lovely kind of soft, delicate, complex single malt. And this is no change from that. So
yeah, it's quite elegant.
Yeah, exactly. It's really soft, really. It's obviously slightly sweet as well. The wine casks for me lend maybe a little bit of extra fruit, a bit of extra. I think you mentioned citrus fruit, but also maybe some apples and pears or something like that.
Yeah,
it's really very pleasant. Like you say, it's perhaps more of a summery dram. I think a lot of people associate the winter with slightly heavier, meatier stuff. But then, there's breakfast to consider too. Christmas morning, New Year's Day, whatever.
I mean, funnily enough, you mentioned breakfast. The lowland whiskies are often colloquially known as breakfast whiskies. This is something my Christmas Day tradition would be making porridge with a bit of whiskey in. I think that's such a lovely Christmas Day breakfast. There's two ways of doing it. I mean, there's the boozy way where you literally just put a shot of whiskey in your porridge, or you can kind of cook the whiskey through during the cooking process. Inevitably burn off some of the alcohol, but will probably result in a little bit more balance of flavour in your porridge.
Yeah. It sounds more attractive to me than a Bucks Fizz, I have to say.
Yeah.
Well, on the palate, it's really really get that citrus kind of sear, or slightly kind of making your mouth water and very very zesty.
Yeah, and there is like a distinct. I do get there's like a certain grapiness to it.
Yes,
It's
but
sort of like
it's almost like a sweet grape, like a aromatic grape, rather than what you might associate with Sauvignon, which would be more sort of gooseberry and dry and so
yeah.
on. So it's almost more like a sweet muscatel or something,
Yeah.
which is not unpleasant. I'm adding a little bit of water to mine just to see if I can tease any more enticing aromas out. Yeah, and actually, when you add the water to it, that grapey, sweet grapiness really leaps out of the glass now. It's lovely.
Be a good whiskey. I think it'd be a nice, and this is what I always say about Auchentoshan. It's that stepping stone between bourbon Irish and Scotch. If you're a particular fan of Irish whiskey, Auchentoshan is going to be really, really familiar as a flavour and a style. And if you're a bourbon fan and you like those slightly sweeter styles of whiskey, then to me, it's kind of the perfect introduction into the brand.
Yes, no, I totally with you. But I could happily sip that away on a summer evening or winter morning. There's just nothing not to like about it. It's just lovely and sweet and aromatic. That grapey, almost grape must seems to really pervade it. It's really really nice. Well, while we're enjoying that, actually, I'll just quickly throw that onto the screen as well, so people can see. It's actually an Amazon exclusive, which I wasn't aware of. So if you want to buy a bottle, you need to go to Jeff Bezos and knock on his door. he's got it all behind his kitchen cabinets or something. There we go.
It's not a bad price, really, for something quite unusual, a higher strength, under 50 quid.
Yeah, exactly. It's very reasonable. Now, while we continue to enjoy that dram and everyone at home is hopefully enjoying it, can you give us a little bit of background on Auchentoshan itself? Because obviously it's been there for quite a while.
Yes.
Perhaps tell us exactly where it is, because when I first visited it back in the day, I didn't realise how close it was to the city centre of Glasgow, and it's beautiful gardens and lovely distillery.
I mean, so it's just outside of Glasgow city centre in Clydebank. Now, I think when most people think of particularly Scottish distilleries, people think of this, lovely flowing valleys, the glens, of course, in Scotland, beautiful scenery. And Auchentoshan's sort of just the opposite of that. It's literally on like an A road, on a dual carriageway. But if you think about it, when these distilleries were being set up, and this was set up or founded at least in 1823, they would have been built near to where people would have been living. So not every distillery is going to have this lovely picturesque setting. So founded in 1823 by a corn merchant called John Bullock. But actually, there's records that show that there was another distillery in the area, distilling illegally, of course, for a couple of decades, called Duntocka. So there's records going back to around 1800. So I think that sounds to me that Duntocka then became Auchentoshan. The names that's fairly similar. The name itself, Auchentoshan, means corner of the field in Gaelic. And then you had two brothers. You had John and George McLaughlin, who were Glaswegians, who had a wine and spirits business, and they took over the distillery in the early 1900s. Then sadly, like a lot of the distilleries during the Second World War, closed down, and there was a lot of bombing across Scotland. And in that Clydebank area, there was only around 7 properties that actually survived, kind of unscathed, if you like, during the war due to bombings. Thankfully, the distillery survived. It didn't get hit. But one thing that did happen was a bomb did hit the the grassland just by it. And there was a crater made by one of these bombs, and that is now used as a pond, and it's used as our cooling water reservoir. So, in the midst of this tragedy and devastation, the ingenuity then kind of goes on, and then they've kind of used that piece of history and that feature now to use that in the distillery. You then had a couple of different business owners throughout the 1940s, 1960s. And finally, Morrison Bowmore took over in 1984. And eventually in 2014, Beam Suntory finally bought the distillery, and it's been in Beam Suntory's hands sort of ever since. So that's just like a little bit of a brief history. And we talked a little bit about lowland whiskies as a whole. Now, traditionally, lowland whiskies were triple distilled, and it's said, I'm not sure whether this has ever actually been confirmed. It's sort of just this kind of romantic story, which I think does fit. It's said that during the industrial boom in the 1800s, when you had lots of Irish people moving over to Scotland to work in the major cities, Glasgow and Edinburgh, it's said that the Irish whiskey was taking too long to come over on the boats into Scotland. And so it's said that the lowland distilleries around Glasgow, around Edinburgh, started to make whiskey in an Irish style. So traditionally, that would have been triple distilled, much lighter, much more delicate. And so the lowland distilleries saw this kind of market to make Scottish whiskey in this Irish style. So when people think of traditional lowland whiskey, you generally think triple distilled, light, more like Irish whiskey in style. Now, it's not always the case. And now Auchentoshan is the only Scotch whiskey that triple distills everything that they produce. There's obviously other distilleries that will do triple distilled expressions, and I know Rosebank is reopening soon. That will be triple distilling everything, I presume. But at the moment, we're the only true, completely triple distilled whiskey. So that means once we've made our second distillation, we've taken that 75% ABV spirit, we've put it through a third spirit still, and raise the ABV all the way to 81%. So you've got that like really, really delicate spirit, which then enables those casks to really take on flavor. So it helps with the maturation. It means you can get a flavor quite quickly using that really high ABV spirit.
Brilliant. Thank you for that. How are you getting on with the Sauvignon Blanc finish?
I like it. It's not one I've had this bottle a while, and it's, for today, it's nice to revisit it. And actually it's remarkably drinkable. It's so easy. It's definitely one of those whiskies that it's almost like you don't really have to think about it. I'm sure you have those whiskies. I can see quite a few behind you where you've got kind of like cask strength Laphroaigs and Lagavulins where, I have to really be in the mood for those kind of whiskies, and they're more of a challenge to me to kind of sit down. Whereas this, it's like, oh yeah, pour some of this, just ease into the night or the afternoon or whenever you're kind of enjoying your whiskey. I'm really liking it.
Definitely a session whiskey, which you could quite easily polish it off with a couple of friends. No issue whatsoever. Now, thinking about the next 12 months or so, we're all hoping that things start to open up again. I think we're all sick of it, frankly, and very bored, and we just want to see each other and have fun and live life again. But notwithstanding that, in terms of Auchentoshan, are there any exciting new bottlings or expressions in the works for over the next year or so?
Pardon me. At present, there's nothing that I know about. I know we've just launched a new distillery cask that's available at the distillery. So if you're in the area, you can go and pick up that. We've rebranded our packaging. So I was going to grab it, but I don't think it's there. But we've rebranded our packaging. So you can see the slightly new label of the 3-wood and the American oak and the 12-year-old. So we're trying to sort of get that out, and we're trying to kind of create a little bit more of a prominent brand Before the packaging was fine, but it was a little bit kind of understated. So we tried to modernize the packaging so it's kind of getting more people to see it and introduce people into the whiskey itself. So for the moment, I don't have any kind of big news about new bottlings for the UK market. Be worth looking out for the 3rd edition of the Bartender's Malt, which again hasn't come into the UK market. But if you shop around online, that'll be available hopefully soon, and that's something that we did in collaboration with bartenders.
But you have quite a range anyway already, don't you?
Yeah.
You have 4 or 5 in the core.
Yeah, so the core range made of the Auchentoshan, the American oak, the 12-year-old, the 3 woods, the 18 and the 21. So yeah, a decent range.
So plenty for people to go at.
Yeah.
Now, just taking off your Auchentoshan hat for the minute.
Yeah.
Are there any other whiskies or spirits from around the world which are kind of ticking your boxes at the moment? Really kind of getting the juices flowing with you. Is there something you've tried recently that you like?
Yeah, so I think one of the standouts for the year, and yes, I mean, hands up, I'm gonna completely admit it's one of the brands I work for, so I'm completely biased here. But the new Lafroig 10 cask strength, the new Lafroig sherry finish 10-year-old, I thought was just outstanding as part of a new addition to the Lafroig core range. I just think it's got so much going on, and we talked about challenging whiskies, and yes, it's definitely one of those challenging whiskies, and I definitely have to be in the mood for it. But that was just phenomenal. When I heard about this 10-year-old sherry finish coming out, I thought, it's probably going to be a little bit light on the sherry, but actually, it's really, really quite heavily sherried.
Yeah,
and so to have that as part of like a current ongoing range is great. So that's one of the whiskies that kind of really kind of got me going, so to speak. So
yeah, it's a fantastic whiskey. Actually, we were doing the Lafroig cask strength recording the other day, and wow, that packs some punch. If you haven't tried that yet, viewers, I would have that as your last whiskey of the night.
Yeah.
Because it takes no prisoners.
Indeed. I'm also really excited. Sorry, go on.
No, go on ahead.
Close home to me in Birmingham. I know they're a few years off yet, but we finally got our first Birmingham whiskey distillery called Spirit of Birmingham. I think he's got one of those stills, those kind of stills that kind of can do anything.
Okay.
And he's making his own mash, and I need to kind of go visit there and see what he's doing, because they've released a vodka. I think there's plans to release a gin, and eventually there'll be a whiskey.
Right.
So that's actually really exciting to have that local, and yeah, I can't wait to kind of taste that finally and taste what they're doing there. So
yes. Well, it does feel like there's a new distillery popping up somewhere at least once a day at the moment, which is great. I mean, more the merrier. And many of them are creating some very interesting stuff, which is being released. Finally, Joe, aside from whiskey, which I know runs through your veins, is there anything else that you like to tipple? What's your other kind of? Have you got another that you reach for?
Spirits wise, my most kind of go-to spirit after whiskey is probably rum. And I always have this plan to slowly drink down my whiskey collection and then build a completely separate rum collection. It hasn't happened yet because I just keep adding to my whiskey collection.
Yeah, exactly.
Never goes down. So I do drink a rum as my main spirit when I'm not drinking whiskey. But my fiance runs a wine bar, so we get a lot of really nice wine. So I do really like a nice, talking of Sauvignon Blanc, I do like a nice kind of aromatic white wine. I mean, I like all sorts of wine really, but if I was kind of to go to a wine, it'd be something like a Alsace Gewürztraminer or a Riesling or a nice Burgundy Pinot Noir. So yeah, wine is a big one for me. I don't drink a huge amount of beer, but I do like beer. It's just something that I never kind of go into the habit of buying beer regularly. It's just something, when I'm out and
Yeah.
about, and I'll go to a specific beer bar to drink, really good quality beer.
Yeah.
Yeah.
That's good to hear. Good to hear. It's always good to have a few strings to your bow. Anyway, Joe, listen, it's been really lovely talking to you once again, and thanks again for popping in and giving us some time to go through the Auchentoshan. But for now, I'm going to say Slanjavar to you, and have a wonderful Christmas and New Year, and all the best to you and your family and everyone at Edrington. But thanks once again. Cheers, Joe.
Cheers.
And thanks everyone at home. I hope you're enjoying it. Cheers.